Florida. So let's talk about this abnormal bleeding and whether or not, what's going on with that. So as we know, I'm a gynecologist, so I deal with abnormal bleeding all the time. And I thought that was interesting when I was actually reading an article from Thinx, which is spelled Thinx, and it's actually a company that makes, if you guys are not aware, they make undergarments for women who are for bleeding. So instead of having to wear a pad or a tampon, these are absorbent underwear. So I don't have to deal with that anymore. But for women that do have periods and don't want to be laden down with pads, tampons, etc. Their undergarments are actually quite wonderful, and I do utilize them with my daughter, and I have lots of friends and family that use them, so it's pretty neat. There are other companies that also do it as well. I think Thinx was one of the first companies. They also do undergarments for women that have urinary leakage, so once again, it's an absorption thing. So something to look into, because pads can become outrageously expensive, especially when you have urinary leakage. But anyway, so they actually were looking into this, and they broached the subject about whether or not there seemed to be any kind of a link between abnormal bleeding and the COVID-19 vaccine. So what I will tell you is that I deal with, like I said, women every single day, and I deal with abnormal bleeding on a daily basis. And the things are wonderful. I personally have not seen that. I have not seen that there's a significant increase in abnormal bleeding. I always tell people that my abnormal bleeders come out in the fall, and I think and I'm not that good with all of the planetary things and stuff, but I feel like the moon must be in a certain area or something like that, because I just see them fall out of the woodwork. I don't know if it's because the end of summer and the way people feel is like back to the grindstone or whatever in the fall months or what have you, but I definitely see tons of abnormal bleeders in the fall, unlike the rest of the year. And I would say that I have not seen a significant trend of people post-COVID coming in with abnormal bleeding. But now I'm going to be looking out for that. And I'm actually going to start trying to do a little bit more research on that. So I would love for any women who are following me that are still having their menstrual cycle, or if you have your daughter that's having the menstrual cycle and they have had the COVID vaccine, and or if they've had COVID and they've noticed any abnormal changes, please shoot me a message, either post it or send me a DM or send me an email and let me know. I would be very interested. I want to kind of delve further into this because I think it's very interesting. And one of the things that the article was discussing is the fact that it was not looked at as an endpoint in any of the clinical trials, and that it routinely, that women, as we know, are kind of usually on the, sorry, but it's true, short end of the stick when it comes to research, unless the research is specifically geared towards a woman's disorder. So they did not look at that at all. So now they're going back anecdotally, but of course, as we all know, that's not the best way to do a study. It's very easy for people to kind of, what do we say? Hindsight's always 50-50. What is it? Oh God, I'm messing it up. But whatever it is. So, people can always go back and they can change the way history actually took place based on the way they remember it, even if they're not trying to deliberately change what really occurred. But the great thing is that a lot of women have period trackers. So that's another thing. The easiest way and the most accurate way is if you've been following your periods all along with a period tracker and you got vaccinated by all, thank you 2020. What did I say, 50-50? Hey, you got the gist. But if you've been following your cycles along and you did notice the difference, for better or for worse, please let me know. So the thought process is that with the vaccine, we don't know. So it's something that they're gonna start looking into as far as whether or not it seems to be causing maybe a little bit heavier cycles and more irregular cycles after the vaccine, and whether or not it's going to be temporary or not. Since the vaccines are fairly new, we will have to follow it over. I had an abnormal bleeding today, and I was like, "Oh, did you get a vaccine?" And she's like, "No," so it didn't work. But I will be polling my patients. I will be trying to look into it. So what is the question is whether or not it's actually due to the vaccine or whether or not it's due to an inflammatory response from the vaccine. More likely, it's probably that, not the vaccine itself that's actually causing abnormal bleeding, but we do know that a lot of people post-vaccine will develop an inflammatory response, and when the body is in an inflamed response, it basically your cortisol levels are elevated. You go into the fight or flight, whether or not you feel like you're in fight or flight or not, and it does affect and trickle down into your other hormones, and so that may be causing that inflammatory state. If you get a fever, if you get fatigue, and if it affects trickles down into the female hormones, that may be what's triggering the abnormal bleeding. Same thing we know when we get COVID, and so, but we also know with COVID that there does appear to be it does seem to be actually more of a bleeding disorder than it does a lung disorder, in the fact that it appears that it forms very little microemboli. So with that particular case, it wouldn't necessarily be that it was increasing more bleeding. And I haven't seen that yet pan out as well. But I think it's a really interesting thing, and we should see whether or not there is a link, and if so, at what stage in life that would occur. But so far, I have not seen it. Now, anecdotally, yes, they had people send in messages, and lots of women were saying that they did. And the main thing that they were noting was that their periods were coming more frequently for a temporary time frame. So maybe if you normally have a period that's coming, the average is usually considered 28 to 25 to 31 days, and most of us think about it every 28 days. So the people were saying that it was coming more like, say, every 15 to 20 days. So let's stay tuned. Let's see what happens with that. And like I said, I really would like your engagement. And please let me know if you are having any abnormalities so that we can follow that. There are very simple treatments. If you are having abnormal bleeding, you certainly do not have to live with that. It is very common in women. It's common to have an abnormal period just out of the blue. Stress is huge. Stress will definitely cause abnormal bleeding. Steroids, huge. If you have to get a steroid injection, if you receive it, if you have COVID and you receive monoclonal antibodies or any kind of steroidal therapy, expect that you would see some disruption in your cycles. A lot of women, as they get into what we call perimenopause, which is the time around menopause, will see abnormal bleeding. Women after their periods will see, hi Kanisha, will see abnormal bleeding. So don't think that, COVID is the only thing that causes abnormal bleeding. There are lots of things that cause abnormal bleeding. Like I told you, the fall seems to cause abnormal bleeding. I see all my abnormal bleeders then. So the key thing is to know that if it is one fluky thing, and as long as it's not severely heavy, then it's probably nothing that you have to worry about. If you are having heavy bleeding, regardless of the cause, and it's occurring way more frequently, like if you're bleeding twice a month and you're bleeding very heavily. And what I consider heavy is where you're soaking through your protection. If you have to change your protection every hour, if you're doubling up your protection, like using a tampon and using a pad, and you're soaking through that, especially if it's, obviously not a light day, but if it's a heavy duty, especially if you're passing clots that are like this, like the size of a ball. Like, we're not talking about the itty bitty little things, but like if you're passing something like this and you're passing a lot of those, then that's of concern. If you're filling your shoe with blood, that's of concern. Because when you're talking to women and you're talking about bleeding, it varies. If you've always had heavy periods, that's normal for you, and so you would not think that that was out of the norm. And so I found that it's very subjective. It's hard to get a gauge on women as far as the level of their bleeding unless I actually examine them, I actually see the bleeding myself, and or we are doing blood work. And of course, if you're losing enough blood that your blood count is going down, then that is of concern and it needs to be treated. Above all, we don't want to have to get to the level where we're requiring transfusion. And as far as self-treating yourself, if you're having abnormal bleeding, certainly vitamins can be wonderful, iron can be wonderful, as long as it doesn't upset your stomach, it doesn't cause constipation or diarrhea. But you don't want to be treating yourself without you don't want to be taking care of the problem with chasing your tail. You don't want to be chasing your tail. So you don't want to be basically giving yourself supplements with, and if the bleeding is continuing to be abnormal, because you have to treat the bleeding problem or else it's a sieve, right? You're putting in all this good stuff, but it's all going back out the other side. So please do know that if you have abnormal bleeding and it's persisting, that you should get in and you should get it checked out, because there's so many treatments that are out there that are available to help control that. And I always say one of my models is life is short and then you die, and there's certainly no reason to be walking around miserable. So actually it's 4:35 and I've been trying to keep it at about a half an hour. If you guys have any questions, I'm open to them. Otherwise, I was going to be calling it quits for today. And like I said, I will put up a note in the what do you call it, the comment section about trying to get information from people about their bleeding patterns post vaccine or post COVID. So like I said, spread the word and let me know. And otherwise, I am going to let you guys go. It is a wonderful, slightly rainy weekend here in Central Florida, but it's Father's Day weekend, so I know that this topic was geared a little bit more towards our female patients, but if you're a father, you may also have a wife or significant other, so you can spread the news for them. And if not, have a wonderful Father's Day weekend for all of the dads that are out there. Continue to be safe as always, and I will see you guys next Friday at 4 p.m. on Facebook Live. Take care, guys.